Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Welcome. The Iraqi police arrested a suspect after a car bomb detonated in front of the Turkish embassy in Baghdad, injuring 10 people and killing the bomber. The Shiite leader Muqtada Sadr confirmed that he wants to avoid confrontations with the coalition forces, demanding that they set a timeline for their withdrawal from Iraq.
I advise the occupation forces not to interfere with or come near these demonstrations, in order to avoid bloodshed and not suppress the right of freedom and democracy for the Iraqis.
Russia intends to make changes to the new U.S. draft resolution on Iraq presented to the Security Council, setting a deadline of mid-December for the interim governing council to establish a constitution and to hold elections. Israel decides to expel 15 Palestinian detainees from the West Bank to the Gaza Strip, inciting the Palestinian Authority, radical Palestinian factions, and human rights organizations. 3 Palestinians were wounded during a new Israeli incursion into the Rafah refugee camp in southern Gaza. Meanwhile, Amnesty International denounces Israeli demolition of Palestinian homes in the Rafah refugee camp. Syria releases Mohammed Saeed al-Sakhri of the Muslim Brotherhood after being imprisoned for more than 10 months. The Italian authorities handed him and members of his family over to the Syrian government in November 2002. Following his release, al-Turabi expressed that he is prepared to re-establish communications with most of the Sudanese parties. He criticized the alleged political partnership between the government and the People's Movement, if it aims to divide the country's leadership and resources. This is the end of the news in brief. Welcome to the news. A violent explosion targeting the Turkish embassy in Baghdad killed 2 people, including the bomber. In addition, dozens of people were wounded. This car bomb operation occurred 2 days after a similar explosion targeting the Baghdad hotel. The operation also occurred amid discussion of sending Turkish troops to Iraq.
Another car bomb explosion in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. However, the target this time was the Turkish embassy. Coincidentally, this car owner was near the embassy at the time of the explosion.
When I got to the Turkish embassy, the explosion happened. It was very strong, and I could not see in front of me. I was afraid that another explosion was going to happen, so I opened the door and got out of the car to save myself.
The U.S. forces tightly surrounded the embassy, closing off all roads leading to it. Meanwhile, an American officer said that a few days ago they had increased security around the Turkish embassy.
In this particular case, we saw a need.
In this particular case, we saw a need to push traffic further away from the building in order to protect the cars from an explosion like this one, from killing or injuring the people inside. We did that 3 days ago, and the plan succeeded. We were able to prevent any loss of life or any major injuries for people inside the embassy.
As is the case in the recent bombings in Iraq, the bomber did not leave any evidence that would identify him.
We don't have any information about.
We did not have any information about the driver of the car or the amount of explosives. The FBI, the United States military forces, and the Iraqi police are currently investigating the incident.
This explosion occurred 2 days after the violent explosion that blasted the Baghdad hotel. Thus, the use of car bombs for the suicide operations is the preferred method in striking various targets, such as Iraqi police stations, embassies, and hotels. The attack on the Turkish embassy comes amid the U.S. persistence of sending Turkish troops to Iraq. Today's attack is a message to Turkey, since it plans on sending its troops to Iraq. Meanwhile, the majority of the Iraqis reject the presence of Turkish troops in their country. This is part of a chain of explosions demonstrating the lack of security in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. Mustafa Azharid, Abu Dhabi Television, Baghdad.
Meanwhile, Shiite leader Muqtada al-Sadr stated that along with other Shia leaders, they want to put down incitements in the country, adding that the government he intends to establish will be approved by the people, unlike the current governing council. During a press conference in Al-Najaf, al-Sadr noted that the difference between his government and the governing council is that the latter is subject to U.S. scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Iraqi people are the only ones who have the right to evaluate his government. Al-Sadr demanded that the coalition forces set a timetable for their withdrawal from Iraq.
My problem with the occupation forces is that they don't approve of my government. They want to stop the Iraqi people from going out to demonstrate and voicing their opinion by surrounding them and gathering their military forces in order to scare the Iraqis. I advise the occupation forces not to interfere with or come near these demonstrations in order to avoid bloodshed and not suppress the right of freedom and democracy for the Iraqis.
The reconstruction of Iraq is a major topic on the agenda of Arab and international conferences. The U.S. is trying to attract as many funds as possible for Iraq to ease the financial burden. This coincides with the distribution of the new Iraqi currency. However, the biggest obstacle is how to deal with Iraq's international debt and interest. This creates huge complications that are intertwined with politics and ulterior motives. When donating countries met to discuss Iraq's debts and how to reschedule them, the participants encountered a basic problem. They could not figure out the size of these loans. The U.S. tried to take advantage of this situation by pressuring European and Gulf countries to cancel the loans that were given to the former Iraqi regime. The U.S. also tried to minimize these debts, but of course, not because it serves the interests of Iraqi people. Rather, because resolving this problem makes the reconstruction of Iraq a lighter burden on the U.S. Then, the United States can ask the UN to share financial resources, as well as the responsibilities of resolving the Iraqi quagmire. Furthermore, oil profits will not be used to pay for Iraq's international debts. Rather, they will go directly to private companies that will be in charge of the reconstruction, most of which are American and British. No one knows the exact size of these debts because the numbers vary. According to the Strategic Research Center in Washington, the estimated debt is $380 billion, making Iraq one of the most indebted countries in the world. However, according to the latest figures from the World Bank and international economic reports, the debt is only $118 billion. $55 billion owed to Gulf countries, $17 billion owed to European countries, $23 billion owed to commercial and financial institutions, $3 billion owed to the U.S., and $20 billion owed to various entities. Political analysts point out that most of these loans were not used to further Iraqi economic interests or to develop the country. Rather, most of these loans were used to purchase weapons and finance war campaigns that the former regime launched both inside and outside of Iraq. Thus, the legality of these loans is in question. Were these loans given to Iraq as a country or to Iraqi officials as individuals? The latest American war has complicated the economic and security situation in Iraq, driving the country into further chaos. The ones who will end up paying the price are the Iraqi people themselves.
After the U.S. realized that the problems in Iraq are mounting up, and after Sharon continues to encounter more problems, the U.S. administration insists on opening new war fronts, searching for an exit strategy that will pull the Israeli and U.S. administrations out of their uncomfortable positions. After the events of September 11, the U.S. depends on its superpower status and war mentality that has dominated the decision-making process in the White House. Taking this into consideration, Washington is still working effortlessly to make matters difficult for Syria. in one instance, pointing out the need to close the Syrian borders with Iraq, and in another instance, accusing Syria of harboring terrorist organizations, meaning Palestinian resistance movements. Today, the U.S. claims that Saddam Hussein has managed to deposit $3 billion into Syrian banks. In addition, a law called Syrian Accountability Act has found its way into the U.S. Congress after the White House withdrew its opposition to it. The objectives of this coordinated U.S. and Israeli accusations and attacks against Syria are no longer secret. Now the logic of force is stronger than the forces of logic. Perhaps this explains the calm Syrian response reflected in pleading with the UN Security Council to stop the Israeli aggression against Syria. However, Damascus reminded the world of its right to defend itself. Every once in a while, the shamed U.S. administration tries to suffocate Damascus by creating accusations to build up a case against Syria, using the tactic of engaging in new conflict by making inaccurate accusations and claims, fully aware that Israel is playing a part in creating them. Colin Powell visited Damascus, taking with him what is described as the basket of American demands. Then, the Israeli airstrikes occurred. 2 days later, the International Affairs Committee in the U.S. Congress adopted what is known as the Syrian Accountability Act. Today, the American and Syrian relations are in a critical stage, as U.S. congressmen are scheduled to vote on the Syrian Accountability Act this week. It is expected that the bill will pass with a majority, after the White House withdrew its opposition to it. However, 2 days earlier, the U.S. proceeded with its plans against Syria. In this regard, the New York Times quoted an official from the Bush administration, who refused to disclose his name, said that the U.S. suspects that the former Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein, has managed to deposit $3 billion into Syrian banks with the knowledge of the Syrian government. The official also claimed that the U.S. asked Syrian officials to return the money to Iraq, adding that Washington was not satisfied with the level of Syrian cooperation in this regard. The American newspaper explained that the demand was made by the U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, when he met with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad last May in Damascus. However, Syria denied these reports. The Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara, who is attending the International Islamic Conference held in Malaysia, said that these reports are manufactured and untrue. Meanwhile, the Syrian ambassador in Egypt, Yusuf Ahmed, said that the Israeli airstrike on Syria was an American message delivered through Israel as a punishment to Syria for its opposition to the U.S. and British invasion of Iraq, adding that Washington has not forgiven Syria for its political performance at the UN Security Council during the Iraqi crisis or for its opposition to American policies in the region. Ambassador Yusuf Ahmed confirmed that his country will defend itself if Israel would launch another attack on it, even if Syria has to stand alone. He also stated that the U.S. invaded Iraq to escape the Afghani crisis, and now it wants to escape the Iraqi quagmire by launching a new war on Syria or Iran, or both. Following the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the U.S. has risen as the world's only superpower, choosing to use military force in dealing with countries that oppose its policies.
The occupation army launched a new aggression against the devastated Rafah refugee camp in the southern Gaza Strip. 6 Palestinians were injured and more houses were demolished. The temporary Palestinian government said in its first meeting that it would send a letter calling on the International Quartet to refrain Israel from conducting more atrocities.
Israeli occupation forces attacked the Gaza Rafah refugee camp again. 2 days ago, a 3-day massive Israeli aggression on Rafah left 8 Palestinians dead, more than 80 injured, and around 100 houses demolished, rendering around 1,500 homeless. About 40 tanks backed by Apache warplanes launched the new incursion into the refugee camp at dawn amid heavy fire. So far, 6 Palestinians have been injured in the aggression. Palestinian medical sources said that among the injured was a 12-year-old boy who was in a serious condition after being struck by shrapnel from a tank shell. Israeli occupation forces destroyed 3 houses in the latest raid. Army helicopters swooped overhead and opened fire. Israeli occupation soldiers armed with machine guns took up positions in tall buildings and barged into houses in search for tunnels said to be used for smuggling weapons. Palestinian fighters clashed with the occupation forces. Israel's ongoing aggression topped the first meeting of the Palestinian Temporary Government headed by Ahmed Quraya to hand in portfolios.
Letters will be sent today to the American administration and the European Union, the Russians and the United Nations and other countries in order to explain the situation. And it's very obvious that what happened in Rafah refugee camp is the beginning. Is the beginning of the scheme to reoccupy the West Bank and Gaza and to destroy the Palestinian Authority.
Despite the massive aggression, the new government discussed prospects for a new ceasefire deal with the Israelis. The temporary cabinet was already in tatters due to differences between Palestinian chairman Yasser Arafat and Quraya over the post of interior minister. The two agreed to have a one-month government after Quraya insisted on handing the portfolio to Nasser Youssef, while Arafat wanted Hikmat Balawi. The Palestinian Prime Minister said he is likely to resign after the end of the one-month term in office. The Interior Minister post was left vacant, but it would be run by the National Security Board headed by the Palestinian Authority chief.
Human rights group Amnesty International described Israeli raids at the weekend on the Gaza Strip town of Rafah that killed 8 Palestinians as a war crime. Amnesty said in a statement, quote, "The repeated practice by the Israeli army of deliberate and wanton destruction of homes and civilian property is a grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law and constitutes a war crime," unquote. The organization called on the Israeli authorities to put an immediate end to the demolition of Palestinian homes and the use of excessive force against unarmed Palestinians, which frequently result in the killing and injuring of unarmed civilians, including children.
The meetings of the Islamic Congress Organization member countries' foreign ministers opened in Kuala Lumpur, the Malaysian capital, this morning with the participation of Mr. Farouk al-Shara and the delegation accompanying him. More follows.
This is the third day of the OIC meetings in Malaysia. The conference is getting more impetus with the foreign ministers starting their sessions. Fine-tuned resolutions is the task before them, as the New Straits Times says. Today's opening session began with a recitation of verses from the Holy Quran by a young Muslim boy. Sheikh Khalifa bin Hamad Al Thani, the representative of Qatar, which chairs the 9th Islamic Summit, presented a statement in which he thanked Malaysia, the new host of OIC, and appreciated the motto of the summit, OIC for knowledge and moral issues. He also criticized Israel's continued occupation of the Palestinian territories and violation of international legitimacy resolutions, along with the latest aggression against Syria. The chairmanship of OIC was then handed over to Malaysia. Mr. Said Hamid Al-Bar, the Malaysian Minister of Foreign Affairs, then delivered a statement in which he expressed Malaysia's pride to host the OIC session. In his statement, Mr. Al-Bar referred to the challenges confronting the Islamic Ummah, like globalization, the situation in the Middle East with Israel's continued atrocities, the ambiguity of the situation in Iraq, terrorism, and Israel's latest aggression against Syria. On this issue, Mr. Al-Bar, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia, said,
"While the situation in Palestine and Iraq remained tense and dangerous in an already fragile and volatile region, another front for confrontation is added with the recent Israeli air raid in Syria on October 4, 2003. This blatant act of aggression against Syria, a fellow member of the OIC, must be condemned in the strongest terms as provocative, arrogant, and dangerous. The OIC member countries must extend their full and undivided support and stand in solidarity with the government and people of Syria, as well as with the government and people of Lebanon in their legitimate right to defend their sovereignty and integrity and in confronting the Israeli military adventurism.
In the closed session, Foreign Minister Farouk Shara spoke about the OIC and the necessity of abiding by what is decided by its member states. Concerning the issue of terrorism, Mr. Shara said that Israel practices terrorism and accuses others of that. Ending Israeli occupation and the return of Palestinian refugees are the only way out of the problem, Mr. Shara said. With regard to mass destruction weapons, as Shara said, that Israel possesses such weapons without anybody pointing a finger at it, and others, illegally and unlawfully, are accused of having such weapons. The ministerial session was then resumed in a closed session to adopt the conference's agenda. The 3 committees were set up for consideration of the draft reports and draft resolutions to be submitted to the 10th session of the Islamic Summit Conference. One for political, legal, information and Muslim communities affairs, another for economic, administrative, financial, and science and technology affairs, and a third for cultural and Islamic affairs. Such issues were under discussion in a brainstorming session attended by the heads of delegations plus 1 official from each participating country. Topics for deliberations included revitalization of OIC and development in Muslim countries. At a later time, the brainstorming session concluded by summation and concentration of the Putrajaya Declaration on knowledge and morality and unity and dignity for the progress of Ummah for adoption at the 10th session of the Islamic Summit Conference. Tomorrow's meetings of this conference would wrap up today's foreign ministers' deliberations into summations and resolutions to be presented before the heads of states of OIC Summit on Thursday. This is Syrian TV Channel 2 reporting from Putrajaya, Malaysia.
His Majesty the King has held talks with Singapore's President and Prime Minister on expanding economic cooperation between Jordan and Singapore, in addition to Iraq and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. King Abdullah and his host, President S.R. Nathan, said they were keenly interested in forging closer cooperation in economic domains and backed a bilateral free trade agreement. King Abdullah called on the world community to lend support to Iraqi people and help them to form an elected and inclusive national government. Iman Lakour sums up the King's activities in Singapore.
His Majesty King Abdullah has held talks with the Singaporean President S.R. Ethan that focused on enhancing bilateral relations between the 2 countries as well as the latest developments in the Middle East region. King Abdullah expressed his keenness on developing the relations between Jordan and Singapore, particularly between the private sectors of the 2 countries. King Abdullah also hailed Singapore's successful achievement in building one of the strong economies in the world, despite its small size and limited resources. Talks between King Abdullah and President Ethan also touched upon the latest developments in the Palestinian territories as well as the future of Iraq. During his meeting with the Singaporean Prime Minister Goh Chok, the King stressed his support and interest in the Singaporean companies to invest in Jordan and to benefit from the investment environment it provides. Later, both His Majesty and the Singaporean President witnessed the signing of a technical support agreement in the fields of technology and telecommunication that will support Jordan in its e-government initiative.
There are maybe 3 areas that are of utmost importance for Jordan. One is the cooperation in information and communications technology, learning from the experience of Singapore in e-government. Singapore was a pioneer in this particular aspect, and Jordan's ambitions and His Majesty's vision of having Jordan become a pioneer in information technology and in e-government was one of the main areas of discussion, and the agreement that we signed earlier this morning falls within this context. The other important aspect of the negotiations or of the discussions that took place today were the negotiations that started to conclude a free trade area agreement between Jordan and Singapore. First round of negotiations took place in Jordan last week. We expect maybe 6 to 8 rounds of negotiations, and we expect to conclude this agreement by July of next year.
Earlier in the day, King Abdullah's met with Asian young leaders taking part at the Economic Forum, where he briefed them on his vision to develop Jordan and to enable its young people to participate in shaping the future. King Abdullah also highlighted the investment potentials Jordan has to offer, particularly after signing trade agreements with the United States, the European Union, and some Arab countries. His Majesty also met with a number of business leaders who are involved in building and developing seaports. The King presented Jordan's experience in turning the port of Aqaba into an economic special zone and the importance of that port in front of export and import markets in the region. King Abdullah concluded his day with a visit to the Islamic Center in the city and Al-Shakirin Mosque, where he toured the center and listened to a briefing on the services it provides to the Islamic community.
Iran's President Mohammad Khatami presented to Parliament a report on the progress of the Third Economic Development Plan. In his assessment, Mr. Khatami said objectives pursued by the plan having aimed at the economic growth have materialized.
Following the report submitted to the Parliament, President Khatami told reporters that Iran has gone beyond its commitments to the International Atomic Energy Agency and has even implemented some key articles of the additional protocol to the Non-Proliferation Treaty voluntarily. Iran's chief executive then accentuated his country's determination to carry on with its activities in acquiring peaceful nuclear technology. He went on to say, Tehran is ready to remove global concerns regarding proliferation of the atomic weaponry. However, as the president added, Tehran urges other countries not to politicize the nuclear and human rights issues.
Malaysia says Iran is pursuing a purely peaceful nuclear program under UN umbrella. Malaysian Foreign Minister Said Hamid Albar, whose country holds a rotatory presidency of the Organization of the Islamic Conference for the next 3-year period, slammed on Tuesday pressures exerted on Iran by the US and Western states. Speaking at the OIC session currently underway in Malaysia, Albar also said his country refutes the resolution issued on Iran by the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors, as Kuala Lumpur firmly believes Tehran nuclear plans are totally drawn up for civilian and not military purposes. Iranian President Mohammad Khatami said in a meeting with the leader of the Patriotic Union of Iraqi Kurds, Jalal Talabani, on Tuesday, that instability in that war-shattered country is a serious menace for all ethnic groups in Iraq and the entire region. Pointing to the presence of the occupation forces in the neighboring country, Khatami expressed hope a government council will set the scene for domination of an all-Iraqi ruling. For his part, the Iraqi side hailed efforts by Iran to bring peace and security back to his country. And the next piece of news is about Iran's nature. As the cold season gets closer, flocks of Asian and European migratory birds arrive in Mazandaran province, northern Iran. Every year in autumn, Iran plays host to more than 160 species of birds, bounding from Russia, Northern Europe, and Scandinavia to the province.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.